So hello guys, what's up and welcome back to my YouTube channel. It's me, your girl Barrister Neze, and this is Nezeville. Today's story is a heartbreaking one, unbelievably gut-wrenching. It is the story of wickedness and moral decadence that has now taken over many children. It is the story of Professor Mrs. Fumilola Adefolalu and the very ugly fates that have now befallen her. Professor Fumi was a university lecturer, a professor of biochemistry at the Federal University of Technology, Minna. She is a widow. She used to be married to a husband who was a fellow academician. He was a lecturer and a dean of the faculty at the university. Not so much is known about her children, if she had any, or if they are all grown up and have gotten married, moved out and have faced their respective lives. But what is known is that Professor Fumi didn't live with any member of her family. She lived alone in her apartment at the Baiko area of Minna, there in Niger State. She had a pet, a dog. As one gets older, one might find living alone tasking, even more tasking as a busy working woman. Professor Fumi sure needed some assistance around the house, maybe even some company, so she always got a girl to live at home with her. Mrs. Fumi had a maid who had resided with her for a while and they had an amazing relationship. But somewhere along the line, this maid informed her that she needed to travel, perhaps to go see her family members or something, but she needed to be away for a while. So Mrs. Fumi had no option but to make alternative arrangements. She found a replacement, a 14-year-old girl, an SS2 student named Joy Afekafe. Mrs. Fumi was to care for Joy and be responsible for her upkeep and education, while Joy in turn was to discharge domestic tasks around the house. But it seemed as though Joy nursed an entirely different agenda coming to Mrs. Fumi's house, because the second she stepped in, the minute she got into the house, she started stealing with reckless abandon. It wasn't even up to 1 week in Mrs. Fumi's house. Joy had been caught on several occasions, stealing one thing or the other. And all caution, all counseling, and all correction from Mrs. Fumi fell on deaf ears. Joy was incorrigible. So in the second week of her employment, 2 weeks, and with many countless incidences of stealing, Mrs. Fumi had no other option but to let her go. What else could she have done anyways? Harbor an impulsive kleptomaniac in her home? Of course not. After all, every one of us advocates that if your maid is not conforming to your standard, or if she's not doing what she's supposed to do, rather than start beating her and hitting her, and all these things we see on the internet of how madams beat up their mates, instead of doing all of that, quietly ask them to leave. So yes, Mrs. Fumi was not about to start hitting Joy or doing all of that. She did the right thing. She asked Joy to leave. She must have thought that chapter with Joy was over, but no. Joy felt highly offended by Mrs. Fumi for asking her to leave her house. She had plans to revenge, to take her own pound of flesh, to deal mercilessly with Mrs. Fumi. So Joy approached her friends, her fellow students in school, very dangerous boys named Smart and Walex. She narrated everything that had happened, and then they came up with a well-crafted plan. They came up with a conspiracy to carry out the most devilish acts against her former mommy. So on this fateful day, in the evening of Saturday, the 28th of October 2023, about 4 p.m. that evening, Joy arrived Miss Fumi's house on a motorcycle, and then she knocked. And when Miss Fumi saw her, she was of course surprised to see her. She was one of the least people she was expecting to see. But Joy wore a very sober look look, telling Miss Fumi that she needed to speak to her. Miss Fumi must have thought that Joy had come to apologize for all the behavior that she put up when she lived with her. Mrs. Fumi was a staunch Christian, remember? She didn't believe that any bad blood or enmity should exist between her and the girl simply because they don't live together anymore. She was a kind, modest, down-to-earth woman, perhaps thinking that every other person was like her. Besides, this was just a child, a 14-year-old girl. She was completely unsuspecting. And so she opened the door and her arms to this child. She just opened her own grave. Joy knew that if she had shown up with members of her gang, Smart and Walex, Mrs. Fumi would have grown suspicious and would not have opened the door for them. So their plan was that she would gain entrance first, and when she was in, very shortly after, Walex and Smart would arrive and she would let them in. And that was exactly what happened. Shortly after she got into Mrs. Fumi's house, stringing her on with conversation, Walex and Smart arrived and got entrance into the house. One can only imagine the look of shock that must have been written all over Mrs. Fumi's face. Seeing Joy, her former baby, stand there in her living room with two strange boys looking menacingly at her. She must have begged them not to hurt her, but certainly her plea fell on deaf ears. They first grabbed a very heavy wooden stool and smashed it on Mrs. Fumi's head. The impact was so much, the force was so hard, that very strong stool broke into two. But they came even more prepared. They had a knife with them, and there were several others that they could pick from Mrs. Fumi's kitchen. And so they grabbed another, and then these evil geniuses began stabbing Mrs. Fumi all over her body, her stomach, everywhere, stabbing her and taking life from her with every single thrust. After they were done using the knife on her, they proceeded to slit her throat to confirm that she was gone. They flung their murder weapons on the floor, took one of Mrs. Fumi's towel, cleaned off her blood from their body, flung the towel on the floor as well, and then proceeded to ransack Mrs. Fumi's house, room after room, cutting away with all her valuables, including her phones, her laptop, her jewelries, and everything they could set their eyes on. They even went as far as removing a car battery from a car that was parked inside the compound. These juveniles were not only murderers, they were thieves, robbers. After killing this helpless, defenseless woman, they still went ahead to rob her of everything. And then they fled the scene, leaving Professor Fumi lying dead on the floor, immersed in a pool of her own blood. Professor Fumi was a very devout Christian and an ardent churchgoer, one who will not miss Sunday service for anything. So when her church members did not see her in church on Sunday the next day, it was quite unusual to them, and so they decided to check up on her, especially for the fact that they had called her repeatedly on her phone, but it would not connect. And so they went to her apartment, and what they saw, nothing prepared them for it. And so they reported to the police. The Academic Staff Union of the University of Futmina demanding justice for their member. The case went viral on social media, and the big question was, who killed Professor Mrs. Fumilola Adefolalu? So the police started their investigation, began asking questions from neighbors, and everybody began to find motive, and their interrogations trailed all the way to Joy. Joy was arrested, and upon interrogation, she confessed to the crime. She is now cooling her feet in the Boso division of the Nigerian police there in Minna, Niger State. This story is a very painful one. Once again, another needless loss of life. It further opens our eyes to the evil going on right now, being perpetrated by very young people. One too many of them, recurring even more frequently. The next one, even more gruesome and more needless than the former. On this channel, we covered the case of Chidinma Ojukwu, who was only 21 years when she allegedly fatally stabbed and killed her married boyfriend, Super TV's CEO, Mr. Osifo. And then there was the case of young Omoren, who raped and killed Udwak after posing offering employment to her. And then again was the case of 27-year-old killer boy, who stabbed and killed his influencer girlfriend Docosta and then fled to Sierra Leone to live his best life with a fake identity after abandoning her remains to decay on the floor. And only last week, it was Collins who allegedly killed his lover Justina and was caught by estate security operatives trying to dispose her remains. Let us not talk about the Ilorin students who tied up, killed and stole from their sugar daddy, who had paid them to come perform a threesome with him. These cases are getting too many for comfort. Is this how irrelevant life is now, that one can lose their life over a phone, over unguaranteed wealth as payback for getting a child upset? Is that the meaning, the weight life has been given now by young children? They were no strangers to their victims. They were in a relationship of trust with these people they eventually killed. People who loved them, accepted them, and let them into their lives and their homes. But they all ended fatally and tragically. This is fast becoming a pandemic. And yes, I know that we all cannot be walking on thin ice every day of our lives, but we all have to be careful because no one is too young or too innocent. Well, as I mentioned, Joy has now been apprehended, and in our next video, we will thoroughly analyze her confession. We'll analyze the stand of the law on this issue. Don't forget that this is an issue involving a minor. She's only 14, so the circumstances may be different, legally speaking. And we will also analyze every other issue that have now arisen in this case, including the issue of employing a minor as a domestic staff. But for now, do let us know what you think about this case and everything around it down in the comment section. So guys, we have come to the end of today's video. If you're just seeing me for the first time, or if you've been watching without subscribing, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, turn on your bell notifications, give this video a big thumbs up, drop all your feelings, your feedback, your comments, your thoughts down below, and stay glued because there is so much more coming your way. It's me, your girl Barrister Neze, and this is Nezeville. I'll see you guys in my next one. For now, bye.